I spent the better part of my late 20s working as a shift supervisor for a mid-sized logistics company operating out of a rail freight depot in rural Scotland, about 40 miles east of Inverness. It was an unglamorous job, coordinating overnight inventory checks, managing the loading schedules, making sure the yard stayed secure during the long stretches between train arrivals. But it paid decently, and I was good at it, which is how I eventually ended up with the additional responsibility of inducting new hires. More money, yes. Worth it, debatable. The caliber of person who applies for overnight freight work at a remote depot tends to span a fairly wide range. And over 2 years of running inductions, I had encountered enough oddities to fill a separate document entirely. But none of that prepared me for Desmond. I should say up front that I have never been someone who finds the supernatural remotely convincing. Night work strips that out of you quickly. Spend enough hours alone in large, dark industrial spaces, and you develop a practical, unsentimental relationship with the dark. The noises that buildings make, the shadows that equipment casts, the particular quality of silence at 4 in the morning, none of it ever struck me as anything other than physics. The people who populate those hours with ghosts have, in my opinion, simply never worked a genuine overnight shift and haven't the faintest idea what they're talking about. What genuinely unsettles experienced night workers isn't atmosphere. It's other people. And specifically, it's the particular subset of people that overnight work tends to attract. Which brings me back to Desmond. My supervisor, a taciturn Glaswegian named Mr. Calloway, rang me on a Tuesday evening to say he needed me at the depot by half for the following morning to run an induction for a new applicant. Early start meant time and a half on top of my usual rate. So I accepted without asking too many questions, set 2 alarms, and drove out in the dark through light November sleet with a thermos of tea wedged between my thigh and the gear shift. I arrived at the depot car park at around 4:20, parked near the main gate, and stood outside in the cold to finish my tea and wait. The yard was lit by a row of tall sodium lamps that gave everything a flat orange quality, and beyond the fence the sidings stretched away into genuine darkness. I'd been standing there perhaps 10 minutes when headlights appeared at the far end of the access road. The car pulled into the car park and slowed, and I started walking toward it. The engine note rose sharply before I'd covered half the distance, and the car swung away from me in a long arc around the perimeter of the car park, moving erratically enough that I stopped walking and just stood watching it. It circled once, then again, the headlights sweeping across the fence and the gate and back across me in a way that felt less like confused navigation and more like assessment. I finished my tea. The car eventually came back around and parked about 20 feet from where I was standing. The engine died. The light stayed on for several seconds, then went off too. Nobody got out. I stood in the orange light watching the driver's side window and the driver watching me back, and I remember thinking with real clarity that this was almost certainly the person I was supposed to train. A sensation that I can only describe as preemptive exhaustion settled over me. I walked to within a few feet of the car and waited. After a moment, the door opened. There were 2 children in the back seat. Girls, I thought, somewhere between 8 and 12, though the sodium lighting made it difficult to be certain. They were watching me from the back window with the alert, still quality of children who are very accustomed to waiting in cars. Their father was already out and walking toward me. Desmond was a compact, dense sort of man, not tall, but built in a way that communicated significant physical resilience, like someone whose body had been placed under sustained pressure and had responded by compressing rather than breaking. He was somewhere in his 40s by the look of him, though something about his overall presentation suggested a man who had arrived at his 40s via an unusually demanding route. His skin had the particular quality of someone who had spent years outdoors in unkind weather, and there was a patchy, inflamed condition along his jawline and the back of his hands that I tried not to look at directly. His coat was a military surplus thing, large and practical, worn in a way that suggested it had been his coat for a very long time. He extended one hand for me to shake. When I looked down, I noticed that the index and middle fingers of his right hand were absent from the second knuckle. I shook his hand without commenting on it, which required a conscious act of composure. "Cold enough," he said. His voice had a texture to it that made me think involuntarily of rust. I agreed that it was. "This place any good?" he asked, with a gesture toward the depot that seemed to encompass a broader question than the facility's general quality. I told him it was a straightforward operation and that the overnight work was mostly routine. He nodded slowly, as though filing this information somewhere for later consideration. While I was absorbing all of this, one of the girls in the back of the car pushed the door open and began to climb out. She shared certain physical characteristics with her father and had the same watchful quality in her eyes. She'd gotten one foot on the asphalt when Desmond turned from me and addressed her in a voice of such sudden and absolute authority that I actually took a step backward. "Greta, get back in that car." The girl froze. "Back in the car. Close the door. Don't open it again." She retreated and pulled the door shut. Desmond turned back to me as if nothing had occurred. I stood there for a moment processing what I just witnessed. Not the instruction itself, but the way it had been delivered, the complete absence of any mediating tone, the industrial-grade certainty of it. And then I told him we should begin the walk-around. I took him around the perimeter of the yard first, explaining the fencing protocol and the checkpoint system we use to confirm the integrity of the barriers between arrivals. He walked alongside me at a slight angle, closer than felt natural, and he listened without asking the sorts of clarifying questions that most new hires ask. What he did ask about was considerably more interesting. He wanted to know which staff members were women and whether I socialized with them outside work hours. He wanted to know if any part of the wider grounds was unmonitored and whether the management ever conducted unannounced checks on overnight staff. He asked me, at one point, whether I'd ever been in a situation at work where I'd needed to physically intervene with someone, and when I gave a brief and deliberately vague answer, he pressed for specifics with an attentiveness that I found deeply uncomfortable. He seemed to find something pleasurable in the subject, a quality of forward lean and sustained eye contact that belonged to a different kind of conversation than the one I'd expected to be having before dawn in a freight yard in Inverness-shire. The smell I noticed gradually over the course of the walk-around. I mention it only because it was distinctive and persistent and contributed to a general picture of a man whose relationship with ordinary maintenance was strained. I don't take pleasure in noting it. I note it because it was part of the experience. We finished the induction material in about an hour. Desmond then stood by the fence and talked at me for what I conservatively estimate was an additional 40 minutes. He covered a range of subjects with no apparent organizing principle. A property dispute with a neighbor, the failings of a previous employer, the general untrustworthiness of people in management positions, and recurring returns to his interest in the female staff and the unmonitored areas of the grounds. I gave progressively shorter responses. He didn't seem to require them. When I finally got back to my car, I sat in it for several minutes before driving. Then I called Mr. Calloway on his mobile, which he answered on the second ring, despite the fact that it was not yet 6 in the morning. I explained what the past 2 hours had been like. I was specific. I told Calloway that Desmond represented a genuine liability, not for atmospheric reasons, not because he had made me personally uncomfortable, but because the combination of his questions, his demeanor, and his apparent interest in the building's blind spots made him, in my professional assessment, a security risk in an operation whose entire function was security. I used those exact words. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he told me to be back at the depot the following morning at 4:30 to continue the induction. I asked if we were still discussing the same person. I said Desmond's name to confirm it. Calloway told me, in a register I had genuinely never heard from him in 3 years of working together, to stop questioning his decisions. His voice had taken on a quality of controlled anger that seemed entirely out of proportion to what I'd said and entirely inconsistent with the person I knew him to be. I sat in the car park in the dark listening to this and feeling something cold that had nothing to do with the November morning. The conversation ended shortly afterward. I drove home in the early daylight, turning the whole thing over. I showered for longer than usual, which I'm not going to pretend wasn't partly about the smell I'd been standing next to for 2 hours, and I spent most of the day sitting with the question of what exactly connected Desmond to Calloway in a way that produced that kind of defensive reaction. Family was the first thought, an obligation of some kind, something Calloway owed or had been asked for. I couldn't make the geometry work regardless of which angle I approached it from. What I could do was call Calloway back and negotiate a transfer, which after a longer conversation than I'd hoped for, I succeeded in doing. The following morning, I was assigned to a different site entirely. I didn't go back to the freight depot for the remainder of my time with the company. I left that job about 18 months later, and I've thought about that morning a handful of times every year since. Not because it frightens me, exactly, but because of Calloway's voice on the phone and the two girls in the backseat of the car watching me through the window. I wonder how they've grown up and what they've grown up around. I wonder what Calloway knew about Desmond that I didn't, and whether he knew it before or after he made him permanent. Some questions are self-contained. They don't open out into anything, and you carry them more or less indefinitely because there's simply no mechanism by which they resolve. That one is still with me, 12 years later, and I suspect it always will be. I spent the first half of my 30s working as a site safety coordinator for a government-contracted nuclear waste processing facility in the remote interior of Scandinavia, roughly 90 kilometers northwest of Kiruna in northern Sweden. I know that sounds like the setup to a cautionary documentary, and in fairness, the work was exactly as unglamorous as it sounds. The facility was a sprawling complex, 14 surface buildings, and an interconnected network of sealed underground vaults built into the bedrock, all of it spread across approximately 30 square kilometers of protected boreal forest. The site had been operating since the late 80s and had accumulated, over the decades, a relationship with the surrounding wilderness that struck most first-time visitors as incongruous. Wolves denayed in the tree line, less than a kilometer from the eastern perimeter. Elk moved through the facility's outer buffer zone so regularly that the grounds crew had stopped logging the sightings. The whole thing was ringed by a double security fence monitored by motion sensors and cameras, and twice every 24 hours a pair of site staff ran a full perimeter check to confirm the fencing was intact and all vault access points were sealed and logged. This is the story of the one night the day shift forgot to do theirs. My colleague at the time was a Norwegian named Erik Strand, 6 years my junior, chronically underslept, possessed of a dark sense of humor that made 18-hour winter nights significantly more bearable. We were about an hour into a quiet evening in the operations room, each of us working through paperwork that absolutely could have waited until morning, when the site supervisor's door banged open and Bergstrom walked out looking like a man who had just discovered something deeply inconvenient. The afternoon crew had signed off on the perimeter log without completing the circuit. He'd found the gap in the timestamped checkpoint data 20 minutes ago. Protocol required that the check be completed and logged before midnight, or a mandatory incident report went to the regional authority, the kind of report that generated audits and visits from people with lanyards and disappointed expressions. Erik and I were the only site staff currently signed in. The math was obvious, and Bergstrom did not belabor it. We were not thrilled. Erik had been discussing, at some length, a pizza from the canteen he had been planning to eat. I had been 6 pages from finishing a report that I could now apparently look forward to completing it too in the morning instead. We collected our radios, our thermal layers, our head torches, and our access cards, and we walked out through the operations block into air that was, on that particular evening in late February, approximately minus 19 degrees Celsius. The perimeter fence check came first. The facility's outer boundary described a rough oval through the forest, and running the full circuit in one of the site vehicles took the better part of an hour at the kind of careful crawl that actually lets you inspect the fencing rather than simply drive past it. Everything was intact. Nothing had been cut. Nothing had been disturbed. By the time we returned to the equipment shed to begin the vault checks, it was past midnight. The sky was a hard black dome without a single visible star, and Erik announced that he needed a cigarette before we continued. He pulled over, killed the engine, dropped out of the cab, and leaned against the rear panel of the vehicle with his lighter cupped against the wind. I got out too, because standing alone in the cab in the dark with the engine off was somehow more uncomfortable than standing in minus 19 degrees. We stood in silence while he smoked. The forest around us was completely still. No wind, no movement, no sound beyond the distant low-frequency hum from the ventilation stacks of the processing building 300 meters south. Eric finished his cigarette and flicked it into the snow. We climbed back into the cab. He turned the key. Nothing. Not a groan, not a click, not the faintest suggestion that anything was happening inside the engine. He tried again. Again, nothing. He looked at the instrument panel and then looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both sat with this for a moment before he tried the radio. Silence. Not static, not broken signal. Silence. The kind that suggests something structural has gone wrong, rather than something you can fix by repositioning the antenna. We tried switching frequencies. We tried the vehicle's mounted radio rather than the handhelds. We tried for several minutes and received, on every attempt, nothing at all. The cold was already beginning to work its way through our layers. Eric said several things in Norwegian that I won't reproduce here, but understood contextually. We had two options. The sensible one was to stay with the vehicle on the service road, wait, and trust that Bergstrom would notice when we failed to check back in and send someone out. The other option, which Eric proposed and which I agreed to with a speed I have since reconsidered at length, was to cut through the forest to the older section of the compound on the facility's western edge, which lay roughly 2 kilometers through the trees, and complete the vault checks on foot from there. We both knew the terrain reasonably well. We had head torches. The temperature was survivable for the duration of a 2-kilometer walk, provided you moved with some purpose. And we were, as previously established, very annoyed and not thinking particularly clearly. The forest between the service road and the western vaults was old growth. Stands of spruce so dense that the canopy overhead reduced our head torch beams to narrow columns of yellow light that gave you about 4 meters of visibility in any direction before the trees absorbed everything. The snow underfoot was undisturbed and varied without warning between firm crust and thigh-deep drift, so progress was slow and the route was indirect. We had been walking for perhaps 25 minutes when the trees thinned slightly, and we emerged onto the access track that ran along the western vault row. The western vaults were the oldest structures on the site, Soviet-era engineering that the facility's original developers had inherited and adapted when the compound changed hands in the early 90s. They were reinforced concrete, each one partially embedded in a low hillside, with heavy steel access doors set flush with the exterior wall. They contained primarily Category B waste, low to intermediate level materials sealed in metal drums. Nothing acutely hazardous in normal conditions, but absolutely not something you want to compromise. The access track ran between 8 of these vaults, 4 on each side, and as we came along it with our torches sweeping left and right, ticking off the door checks one by one, Eric's beams settled on Vault 6 and stopped moving. The access door was open. Not ajar, open. Wide enough that a person could have walked through it without turning sideways. We both stood looking at this for several seconds without speaking. An unsecured vault at a nuclear processing facility is not, to put it plainly, a situation with a comfortable resolution. The list of reasons it might be open ran from the mundane and embarrassing all the way to the genuinely catastrophic, and standing in the dark on a frozen access track with non-functional radios. We had no way of establishing which end of that list we were dealing with. Eric tried his radio again. Still nothing. We looked at each other and made the only decision available to us, which was that we had to go in and establish whether anyone was inside before we sealed it. We drew our emergency response tools. Non-sparking torches, the protocols around energized materials were strict, and approached the door. The smell that came out was cold concrete and mineral dust, and something underneath it that I couldn't immediately name, but that registered as wrong. We went in slowly, sweeping the torches along the drum racks that ran the length of the vault on both sides. Everything appeared to be in order. The drums were sealed, tagged, positioned correctly in their cradles. Nothing had been disturbed. We worked our way to the back of the vault and confirmed it was clear, and I had just exhaled and turned back toward the door when the sound hit us. It came from somewhere inside the vault, a long, sustained, high-pitched cry that had no immediately obvious source and that bounced off the concrete walls in a way that made it impossible to locate directionally. Neither of us moved. The sound rose and then dropped and then rose again, and it was the kind of sound that activates something below the level of rational thought, something old and mammalian that instructs you to run before your brain has finished processing what your ears have reported. We ran, out through the door and down the access track and into the tree line, where we stopped in a clearing about 30 meters from the vault, killed our torches, and stood with our backs to each other in the dark, trying to hear anything over the sound of our own breathing. Several seconds passed. Nothing followed us out of the vault. The forest was completely still again. We stood there for a while. Then we had to go back and close the door because the door had to be closed, and the only people available to close it were us. We walked back up the track in the dark, paused outside the vault, looked at each other, and on a silent count of 3 lunged forward and pulled the door shut and drove the locking bar home in one continuous motion. We stood with our hands on the door, breathing hard, listening. Nothing moved inside. We walked the remaining vault checks at a pace that I would describe as professional but committed, and then we walked the 3 kilometers back to the operations block on the main access road, which was longer but which had the considerable advantage of keeping us out of the trees. Bergstrom was standing in the doorway when we arrived, radiating the specific energy of a person who has been worried and is converting it rapidly into irritation. We told him about the open vault and the sealed door and the sound. He sent the emergency response pair out immediately. Eric ate his pizza. I finished my report. I did not sleep particularly well that week. The investigation took 4 days. What the response team found in Vault 6, after a full sweep and an extensive review of the motion sensor logs, was a Eurasian eagle owl, a large one. Females of the species can reach a wingspan of close to 2 meters that had apparently entered the vault through a gap around the ventilation feed at ceiling height, become disoriented in the dark, and spend an unknowable number of hours demonstrating why the eagle owl's territorial scream has been responsible, historically, for a remarkable number of reported supernatural encounters across northern Europe. The gap in the ventilation housing had been there, the engineers estimated, for several months. Nobody had noticed it. The security review that followed was thorough and unpleasant. Bergstrom was transferred to a desk role at the regional office in Luleå, which was presented as a lateral move and understood by everyone as the opposite. His replacement was a Finn named Radavara, who operated at a baseline level of institutional rigor that made our previous oversight protocols look approximate. Shift logs were audited weekly. Equipment was tested at the start of every rotation. The afternoon crew never again failed to complete a perimeter check. We did not miss Bergstrom exactly, but we were deeply grateful for the remainder of our time at the facility that nobody ever again asked us to walk through 30 kilometers of boreal forest at midnight in February. The owl, as far as anyone knows, found its way back out through the same gap before the engineers patched it. I prefer to believe this. The alternative, that it is still in there somewhere, sealed into the dark with the drums and the silence, is not a thought I particularly enjoy sitting with. I was 22 when I took a position on the night cataloging team at the National Maritime Archive in Cardiff. It was the kind of job that appears in job listings with phrases like ideal for self-motivated individuals and comfortable working independently, which are the polite ways of saying that the work is solitary, the hours are odd, and most people last 3 months before the combination of fluorescent lighting and institutional silence drives them somewhere more sociable. I stayed for nearly 2 years, which tells you something either about my character or my options at the time. Probably both. The archive occupied a converted Victorian customs building 3 blocks from the waterfront. 6 floors of temperature-controlled storage, reading rooms, and administrative offices with a basement level that housed the older physical collections and the facility's server infrastructure. My shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. The building held somewhere between 40 and 50,000 physical documents at any given time, along with digitized records running into the millions. During the day, it drew researchers, historians, the occasional journalist. After 10, it belonged entirely to the night team, which on most evenings consisted of myself and 2 colleagues working different floors, plus the building's automated security system and whatever thoughts you'd brought with you to fill the silence. I had been working there long enough to know the building's rhythms. The heating system made a particular noise on the 3rd floor when the temperature outside dropped below 5 degrees. The service elevator on the east side of the building had a door that didn't fully close unless you pulled it manually. The sixth-floor reading room smelled differently in humid weather. These were the details that accumulated over months of overnight work and that made the building feel, if not warm exactly, at least predictable. I knew what it was supposed to sound like, which is why what happened that particular Wednesday in November has stayed with me clearly for over a decade. It was sometime around 3 in the morning. I had been working through a newly transferred collection of merchant shipping logs on the 4th floor, cross-referencing dates and vessel registrations, and I had come down to the ground floor to refill my water bottle at the break room adjacent to the main entrance lobby. The ground floor at that hour was largely empty. A wide open space of polished stone flooring, display cases, and the unmanned reception desk with its single low-security lamp casting a dim pool of amber light over the sign-in register. I came out of the break room corridor and turned toward the stairs, and as I did, I became aware of a figure moving through the lobby ahead of me. He was moving in the direction of the east wing, unhurriedly, with the particular quality of someone who knew where he was going. From what I could see in the available light, he appeared to be a man in late middle age. I would have guessed 60, perhaps older, wearing a dark overcoat and carrying what looked like a leather briefcase or document bag under one arm. The overall impression was of someone administrative, institutional. We got access visits from the Welsh Government Heritage Department on occasion, and my first thought was that this was someone from that office who had been given access for some early morning purpose I hadn't been told about. These things happened. Communication between the day administration and the night team was not always what it should have been. He was perhaps 8 or 9 meters ahead of me, moving away. I said good evening in the direction of his back, because it seemed rude not to. He half-turned as he walked and said good evening in return. A clear, even-toned response, perfectly ordinary, and then continued around the corner toward the east wing without stopping. I continued up the stairs to the 4th floor and went back to my shipping logs. At 6 in the morning, the day team coordinator, a meticulous woman named Philippa Adler, came in to begin the handover. Philippa had been coordinating the archive's day operations for 9 years and possessed, in my experience, an essentially complete knowledge of anything that was supposed to be happening in the building at any given time. I mentioned the visitor in the lobby as a passing comment while I was signing off on the night log. Not alarmed, simply noting it in case it was relevant to her morning. She stopped writing and looked at me. She asked me to describe him again. I did. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite concern, and asked me to wait while she checked the access schedule for the week. She came back 2 minutes later with the printed schedule and showed me. No visits booked, no access codes issued for the preceding 12 hours, no contractors or consultants expected until Thursday afternoon. She asked if I was certain I hadn't simply seen one of my night team colleagues. Marcus, the 3rd floor cataloger, was tall and wore dark clothing. I told her that Marcus was 28 and built like a rower, and the person I'd seen in the lobby was distinctly neither of those things. She asked if I'd been sleeping. I told her I had not been sleeping. Philippa Adler was, by nature, a composed and methodical person. In 9 months of working parallel shifts, I had never seen her express anything resembling unease. What I saw on her face in the handover room that morning was not unease exactly, but it was something, a careful, watchful quality that I had not previously observed in her, and that made me feel for the first time that something was actually wrong. She asked me to come to the security office with her. The archive's camera system had been installed 18 months earlier as part of a Heritage Lottery Fund renovation and was, by the standards of institutional security infrastructure, genuinely sophisticated. It covered every floor, every corridor, all entrance and exit points, and the display and storage areas, with a resolution high enough to read document labels on shelving from 3 meters. The facility manager, a quiet Welshman named Gareth O'Say, was already in the security office when we arrived. Philippa had sent him a message while I was finishing my sign-off, which told me she had been taking this more seriously than her composed expression suggested. Gareth pulled up the ground floor lobby footage from the period I had described. We watched me come out of the break room corridor. We watched me walk toward the staircase. There was no one else visible in the lobby. No figure in an overcoat. No movement near the display cases. no one turning the corner toward the east wing. The lobby on the camera feed was entirely empty except for me. I watched myself say good evening to the ambient air. I watched the ambient air not respond. Gareth said nothing for a moment. Then he asked if I wanted to see it again. I said no. Philippa's expression had not changed. She asked Gareth to pull up the East Wing cameras for the same window. We watched the empty East Wing corridor for 30 seconds. Then something moved. It was in the far corner of the East Wing ground floor, near the fire door that connected to the staff document storage area. The movement was low and fast, below the level of the shelving units that lined the corridor walls, weaving between the base of the metal shelving stacks with the hangers along the upper rails swaying gently in the wake of whatever was passing beneath them. It was moving at a speed and in a manner that had no relationship to the measured, upright figure I had observed in the lobby. It moved the way something moves when it does not know it is being watched or does not care. I said quietly that the man I had spoken to in the lobby could not possibly move like that. The man I had seen was elderly and formally dressed, and had walked with the slight deliberateness of someone managing a stiff hip or a bad knee. What was on the camera feed was operating on entirely different physical principles. Philippa and Gareth looked at the footage and then at each other in the way that people look at each other when they have reached the same conclusion simultaneously and are waiting to see who says it first. Gareth said, "It could be an animal." We all looked at the footage again. Philippa picked up the desk phone and called the police. She gathered the rest of the night team and the early arrivals from the day shift into the third-floor seminar room under the pretext of a brief all hands. A slightly transparent cover story that nobody questioned because nobody particularly wanted to be asked to walk the floors alone while this was being resolved. Gareth stayed with her in the security office while I sat with my colleagues in the seminar room, listening to the particular silence of a building that you are now experiencing differently than you were an hour ago. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. A woman in her mid-30s named PC Hargreaves and her colleague, a heavier man whose name I didn't catch. We walked them through the footage in the security office. PC Hargreaves watched the East Wing sequence twice without commenting. Her colleague asked, with genuine uncertainty in his voice, whether the camera lens had been contaminated in some way that might account for the distortion. Gareth told him the system was 8 months old and had been tested the previous month. The colleague looked at the footage a third time and asked, more quietly, if there was any possibility it was a dog. PC Hargreaves said she would walk the building. Her colleague remained in the security office with us. We watched the camera feeds as PC Hargreaves moved systematically through the floors, checking storage areas, the reading rooms, the stairwells, the basement level. On the monitors, we could follow her progress. A steady, unhurried figure with a torch, opening doors, checking corners, moving on. After 40 minutes, she returned to the security office and sat down and said she had found nothing. No person, no animal, no indication of forced entry or disturbance. The only anomaly was a small stack of document folders on the second floor that appeared to have been moved slightly from their log position on the shelving, which could have been anything. Air movement from the ventilation system, a minor earthquake tremor of the kind that the building's sensors occasionally registered, human error in logging. There was no way to assign it. Additional officers arrived shortly after. They completed a second sweep. They reviewed the entrance logs, the access records, the alarm system data. No entry event had been registered. No exit event had been registered for any party other than the night team's standard sign-out. The building's perimeter cameras showed nothing. The officers wrote their report and took copies of the relevant footage and left us with an incident number and no explanation. We opened at 9, as usual. The East Wing shelf stood exactly as they always did. The morning researchers arrived and signed in and went about their work and had no idea that 6 hours earlier a rotating team of police officers had swept the building looking for a figure that had apparently entered without triggering any sensor, been seen clearly by a person who had exchanged a greeting with it, and then spent the remainder of the night moving through the East Wing in a manner that bore no relationship to the person initially observed. I finished my shift report and walked out into the Cardiff morning feeling the specific variety of tiredness that comes not from a lack of sleep, but from a sustained period of low-level unease that the body has been quietly managing for several hours. I don't have an explanation. I've thought about it at various points over the years, and I've never arrived at one that accounts for all of the components. The conversation in the lobby, the camera footage showing an empty lobby, the thing moving through the East Wing shelves, and the building's sealed and unbroken perimeter. Each of these things individually has a possible rational account. Together, they don't resolve into anything I can hold steadily in both hands. What I know is this. I said good evening to something in that lobby, and it said good evening back, and whatever it was, it remained in the building for hours afterward doing something in the East Wing that none of us could explain. I'm not calling it supernatural. I'm not sure I have a better word for it. I left the archive 8 months later for a position with more reasonable hours, and I have not worked a night shift in a building that long.